Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for August 3rd, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, more interviews from Orlando as our coverage of the National Homebrewers Conference continues. In this episode, we cover advanced discussions from the conference. We talk to Raj Apte, inventor of the $1 homebrew barrel. Also, author John Palmer gives us some insight on wort fermentability and what's going on with enzymes at particular mash rest temperatures. Well, first I want to check out some email because for the past couple of weeks we haven't gotten around to reading any. Well, I got a note from Kevin in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. He's downloading all our past shows and says he's got a lot of catching up to do. On the issue of sanitization, Kevin says he uses a product called Parasan, which he understands is peracetic acid, and he says he's never had a problem with infections in his beers. Kevin says, as podcasts are listened to around the world, it may be interesting to do a program around the world, maybe concentrating on those countries where home brewing is not widely practiced and where the hobbyists have to be fairly innovative in order to get equipment or ingredients which are readily available to homebrewers in the USA, UK, and I would think Europe as well, says Kevin. And I want to add our friends in Australia to that list of places where homebrew equipment is readily available. I think that's a fun idea, Kevin. I've heard now from listeners on every continent except Antarctica. And, where are you guys? I'm sure there's scientists down there in Antarctica listening to Basic Brewing Radio. Let's hear from you. In several of those places around the world that we've heard from, home brewing is kind of a challenge, and it'd be interesting to hear what our fellow brewers have to go through to enjoy the hobby. I want to give a couple of quick howdies to Richard, who's stationed in the Middle East somewhere, and says it's nice to be able to download the podcast to keep his spirits up. I'm glad that we can help you do that, Richard. Stay safe, and just remember there's plenty of hoppy beers waiting for you back home. And to Mazen, who lives in Beirut, and he is wanting to set up a brewery there in Beirut, Lebanon. I hope you stay safe until there is a resolution down there or over there. And that goes for anyone listening who is in harm's way. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today. Here's hoping that you reach a time soon where fermentation temperatures and sanitization issues are some of the most pressing concerns in your life. On another topic, Brad from Frederick, Maryland says he played my interview with Greg Noonan on water as the technical presentation at a recent BJCP review class. Brad asks if I've considered having a show dedicated to a general introduction to the BJCP preparation and exam. I think that'd be fun and very useful, especially for me, since no one gives BJCP training around here where I live. Brad, incidentally, is a PhD chemist and says this fall I will be teaching analytical chemistry at McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland. And I'm planning on doing a number of beer-related activities. The two that come to mind are evaluating the method of determining hop bitterness in beer, and it's been years since my chemistry class here, Brad, so bear with me. Aluminum-3 ions from an aluminum kettle. Brad says you've discussed this often, and we have. Brad says we have an instrument called the atomic absorption spectrometer that can determine the amount of Al3 ions in boiled water. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing the results of both of those experiments. On the subject of aluminum pots, Brad continues, the one thing people don't know about aluminum is that it rusts. There's a big difference between iron rust and aluminum rust. The red Fe2O3 iron rust, or iron oxide, does not form a bond with the iron metal. Hence, once iron oxide forms, it falls off, revealing more iron metal to be oxidized, such is the case in my first car in high school. This is not the case, he says, with the aluminum metal-colored aluminum oxide, Al2O3. Aluminum oxide adheres to the aluminum metal, providing a highly resistant protective barrier. Brad says, my inclination is that even a brand-new, lightly rinsed aluminum kettle will not release the Al3 ion into solution, or the wort. Having said that, there may be a pH dependence. All metal will dissolve in caustic, but aluminum oxide is much more resistant to caustic. So that'll be an interesting result from that experiment. We'll get to hear if we are getting aluminum in our beers, or aluminum ions anyway. Like I said, it's been a long time since chemistry class. Steve in Sydney, Australia was one of a handful who wrote after hearing our Steve's interview with Steve Hamburg about session beers. I think that would be a trifecta of Steves there. The Sydney Steve and the other brewers who wrote in, they want to hear tips on making session beers that are low gravity but not weak in body. It's another great idea for a show. Just a couple of tips in the meantime. If you're making an extract brew, you can add maltodextrin to help pump up the body of your low-gravity beer. Maltodextrin is a non-fermentable sugar, so the yeast won't turn it into alcohol and CO2. On the all-grain side, if you do a single-stage mash at a higher temperature in the saccharification range, say 154 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll end up creating more less fermentable sugars as well. And more on mashing and mash temps with John Palmer in a few minutes. Donovan from Long Island, New York, wrote in after listening to our interview with homebrewer Matt Riddell in Orlando. Well, it turns out Donovan knew Matt from when he lived in Florida. So small world, at least in the brewing community. Donovan has high praise for Matt and the homebrewers down there in Florida. He says not only do they like to brew, they love to cook, and cook with beer. And he says women are well represented in the homebrewing community down there, so that's good to hear. Incidentally, Donovan and I both took part in the Beer Geek Roundtable on Craft Beer Radio, which may be posted by the time you hear this. A bunch of us beer geeks got together to chat over Skype with Jeff and Greg on CBR. And I emailed Jeff and I said I don't envy his having to edit, all the stuff, because we talked for a long time. And I hope that he cut out the any goofy things that I'm sure I said. I'm not used to having a couple of beers in the evening and recording myself or being recorded and then not having the ability to edit afterwards. So I'm a little nervous about that. But, my trust is I'm trusting your instincts there, Jeff. And you can cut out the goofy stuff. Congratulations to the Good Beer Show for being nominated for a podcast award in the category of food and drink. If you like the Good Beer Show with Jeffrey T. and all the gang, you can do what I did and vote for them on podcastawards.com. It's a lot of email this week, and I'm only getting a little bit of what we've got here. Finally, a couple things. I want to say best wishes to Chris in Newton, Massachusetts, who's brewing beer along with his fiancée for their upcoming wedding in October. And I want to say best wishes to Natalie, who is our T-shirt model on basicbrewing.com. Natalie and her fiancé Colt are getting married this weekend. Best wishes to them. I'm sure they will have a wonderful life together. And, sorry, guys, to break the bad news to you. But Natalie is taken. Now, on to our first interview. A little background. Raj Apte likes to play with fun bugs like Brettanomyces. It was in his trying to find the perfect vessel to get micro-oxygenation levels for Brett that he came up with what he calls the $1 homebrew barrel. Raj is a homebrewer who got into the hobby at 35 after he learned to malt wheat for sourdough bread. And up until that point, he was a teetotaler.
I was really blessed that the guy in the office next to mine, who turned out to be a really close friend, Konrad van Schuylenberg, was from Belgium. And so my first introduction to drinking at age 35 was my homemade wheat beer. My second was to go to Konrad's house and start tasting Belgians. And the Belgian, it's a marvelous thing that in the United States you can get all the great beers of Belgium. In fact, when I went to Belgium, I discovered that you can get them more easily here than you can in Belgium. A lot of things like the Rochefort are hard to get there and easy to get here. So there's some strange turnabouts that way. I did my first beer tourism to Belgium with Conrad. I stayed at his parents' house, and we traveled around, and in 2 weeks we tasted, I don't know how many, we went to a dozen breweries at least, and had a great time. So I think the Belgians definitely are onto something. But it turns out then that if you go through the literature for traditional brewing throughout the world, there's a wonderful United Nations document about traditional brewing in the Third World. And you learn about how to ferment corn and sorghum and all of that, but also tubers like taro. And people are making beer throughout the world out of everything from roots, grains, fruits. It's nothing that people don't make. And there's mold fermentations, there's bacillus fermentations, there are yeast fermentations. They're all different. And they actually all taste not quite the same, but they all have a very closely related flavor palette.
Now, let's talk about your device. But before we get to it, give us a little background. In the fermentation of Saccharomyces, of yeast that we're familiar with, you want to give it oxygen to get going, but then once the growth phase is over, it goes into anaerobic, and that's where the alcohol is produced. With the Brettanomyces needs a bit of oxygen, right?
That's right. The Brettanomyces needs oxygen in its growth phase as well. But the funny thing about it is that it likes to ferment in a microaerobic condition. And Peter Buchard expressed the thought that he thought that plastic was just the wrong way to go, because you can supply the oxygen, but it's not where the Brett are. Whereas in Rodenbach's cask, the Brett probably live in the walls of the cask. And that's where most oxygen is, because the oxygen is coming in through the walls. Then it lives right on the surface and then ferments into the liquid. So because of that, oxygen never gets to your beer physically. And therefore, the oxygen has no chance to oxidize the flavor of the beer. That's how microoxygenation doesn't produce an oxidized flavor. And it doesn't do that even in the kind of conditioning that people do for strong ales, where they've got no Brett. The idea is that the microoxygenate introduces oxygen so slowly that it doesn't produce any free radicals that then produce the cardboard flavor, but rather produces whole molecular oxygen, which is then utilized chemically.
So your thought was you wanted to have the same characteristics as a barrel.
Exactly.
But in a homebrew environment.
That's right. I wanted to find a cheaper way of doing it. I had bought from More Beer some wonderful casks, and I knew that they were producing good beer. But once I had a 10-gallon and a 15-gallon, I had no more budget, and they take a lot of space because they sit on end. And what I wanted was to use carboys because I had them. I had 15 carboys, and my wife wasn't going to let me buy any more stuff. And carboys, you can stack them on a shelf in a corner, and they're fairly space efficient. And if you keep the cardboard box, then you can keep the light out, and now and there's a little bit of insulation, so you've got a really nice home for bugs. You just needed to get the wood component. And so the first version of it I made, I got one of these furniture legs, I removed the hardware. I didn't think to toast it, and I didn't think to soak the wood flavor out of it a little bit to get it a little bit better conditioned. I just stuck it in, and the first thing I realized is that the mouth of a carboy is not round. So I pull out a spoke shave, and I started adjusting, and I made a custom fit for this one carboy. And I realized at the end of trying to do the second one that this was a really bad idea, and that what I really needed was a thick wad of Teflon tape to just make the seal easy. And,
so just to get a picture, since the listeners can't see what you've done, this just looks like a glass carboy with a wooden peg sticking out of the top of it.
That's right, and I started off trying to find an 1.25 inch, where the diameter of a carboy mouth is, oak dowel. And ultimately I did find such things, but they're hard to get, because 1.5 inch doweling is pretty rare for craft people. But then I wandered around, and I found a furniture leg at Southern Lumber in San Jose, and I thought, that could work. And it was made of oak. It was a red oak, which is supposed to produce an inferior flavor, but these people really, I don't really put any stock in that. Chestnut will be fine. I'm sure red oak, if it's properly seasoned, will be just fine too. So I thought, well, I'll give it a try, and it was unfinished. I had to saw there was a Teflon foot at one end, so I had to saw that off. It's for a short table, like a coffee table. I had to remove the mounting hardware off the other end. But then I was left with a beautiful taper of oak, and once I figured out the Teflon tape and the toasting, the rest was really easy. I could just follow my nose and tweak the recipe for that.
And you soak the wood, first of all, to get most of the oakiness out of it, right?
Yeah, and you know, people argue about the merits of American wood versus French wood, and oak in particular. And there seems to be a consensus among winemakers that there are differences in the biology. The size of the pores are different. But the real difference is that the French age the wood for 3 to 4 years before making the barrel. So the wood sits out and ages, and that softens the flavor. Well, I would love to age my furniture legs for 3 to 4 years, and I have enough that I will. But for starters, I needed to moderate the strong oak flavor, and I knew that oak chips, for example, add kind of a harsh oakiness if you just use them fresh, whereas if you use twice as many of them and soak them first in water and discard that water, that you get a more rounded oak flavor, like the second filling of the cask. And I knew from my casks that I had gotten from more beer that I definitely needed to rinse them out with hot water a dozen times before I could even stand the beer that came out of it. So
you take this table leg and you saw the hardware off of it. You soak it, you toast it, and then you have an autoclave, or you have a pressure cooker. So you sterilize it that way. But you said that also you could cook it in an oven for 400 degrees for you don't know how long, but.
Yeah, I think if you go through the web, you can find recipes for sterilizing glassware, and I think that the consensus is that wet sterilization at 15 psi for 15 minutes is the preferred method. But if you have to do dry sterilization, I think it's 400 degrees for half an hour, something like that. But I think everyone should own a pressure cooker, because that's how I do my cereal mashes and don't get them to burn. And I think that so I think it's a useful tool to buy. And America, there's one made in America product that I really like. Is I have a gigantic all-American autoclave / pressure cooker, and I can sterilize 750 milliliter champagne bottles in it. And that's what I do. We're talking about a poor person who had made an absolutely wonderful beer and submitted it for judging here. And the bottles were, of course, divided into the porter category and the best of category. The bottle they opened, one of the bottles was bad. And so they lost a medal because they had one bottle that was bad and the other bottle was good. So I really, Jamil says he uses only brand new bottles, and more power to him. I don't have that kind of money, but I do have 6 or 7 boxes of champagne bottles, and you autoclave those, and they're wonderfully clean. So.
Well, back to our table leg. Now, the reason that you have this is because you're trying to get help me. You're trying to get the oxygen to permeate. Yeah, you're trying to get through the wood.
That's right. I'm trying to get the oxygen to diffuse all the way into the solution. What I don't want is for there to be a puddle of oxygen on the surface. Not because that's particularly bad, but if the sanitation were poor and there were some acetobacter in there, that the acetobacter would then set up its own pellicle. It would fight with the Brett pellicle. The Brett pellicle is easily distinguished because it's powdery. It's not very smooth and shiny like an acetobacter pellicle. So that was one reason why I didn't want a big puddle. And then secondly, I had this image that Peter Buchart had put in my head of wood with oxygen on one side and beer on the other, and the Brett in between getting the oxygen from one side and the fermentables from the other side, and doing the right thing. And we have to remember that although Brett can produce a lot of acid as well, its main function is the attenuation of the residual extract, which is how you can get a fully attenuated, even less than 1.000 gravity, final gravity. So that hyperattenuation increases the alcohol level and produces the characteristic Brett flavors, which is what we're really looking for. For acidity, we can get our acidity elsewhere. The lactobacillus produce the lactic acid, and acetobacter. I actually typically will have a vinegar fermentation running on the side, which is just half-gallon wide-mouth canning jar full of no-hop beer covered with cheesecloth with a nice thick acetobacter pellicle growing on it. And I will typically, at blending time, add any acetic acid that's necessary from there because I don't really want it setting up in my wood.
And it's the wood, it's the quality of the wood to give you that micro amount of oxygen. You don't want a lot of oxygen, but you just want that amount that wood seems to be the material that gives you the right amount.
That's right. And so the options were to go with a plastic homebrew barrel or 5-gallon plastic bucket, and that would produce too much oxygen. Now, if you have sterile conditions and you know that you've only got the breadth that you want in there, and you're very careful, you can clearly make that work. And people have made absolutely wonderful beers that way, and I'm not saying anything against that. But I knew that I didn't have that because I'm a wild and woolly fermenter. I've got something growing everywhere. With kefir, I've got every single beer spoilage organism growing in my refrigerator, and it's the same refrigerator where I've got everything else. So I expect that there's a challenge there. So I wanted to come up with a way of doing it cleanly. And microoxygenation is possible through silicone. And so I thought about bunging with silicone, and then in order to get the direct contact, putting the carboy on its side. And that would then mean that you'd have that air on one side, beer on the other. But I was concerned, firstly, that if the bung popped out, I would have a fiasco. And I didn't want to tie it in place because then I could have an explosion. So you don't want to over-secure it. And I wouldn't have that Brett home. And the affinity between Brett and wood is well understood. One thing I should add is, as part of the fact that we know that there is no Brett blowing around in the magical breezes in Peyottenland, but that the Brett is introduced in the brewery through cooperage. We know that for all of the sour ale production in Belgium. Similarly, there isn't Brett blowing around in any of the breweries here either. It's probably coming in through the wood. And the only place Brett has been found in nature is in sawmills. So its probable biological niche is wood pulp and wood degradation. That's its natural state. Beer is just a happy circumstance for it. But it is actually part of the breakdown of wood. And that's why it seemed like we had to have wood involved.
And then these are reusable. And you just take it out, and you can use it actually to inoculate the next batch, right?
Absolutely. So what I'll do is recently I've been working on a beer that's it's what we would call a porter, although I like to use that term for the traditional blended old ale plus new ale. But it's a medium dark sort of a brown ale, and I wanted to have a characteristic Brett flavor because it's going to be a real English style. And we have to remember Brettanomyces means English yeast. Because it's from Brittany, right? That's the Brettanomyces. The Breton is from Brittany. And it was named by the Belgians, but discovered in an English ale that the Belgians were trying to mimic. So it originally comes from England. So I wanted to make a real English old ale. And so I brew it, and I brew it using a multi-strain wine yeast. I let it fully attenuate, rack it to secondary, give it a week in secondary until I'm sure that it's not really bubbling too much, or basically not bubbling at all. Then I basically switch that fermentation lock with another carboy that has a wooden peg in it that has the same beer because I want to maintain compatibility. And that's how I inoculate the new one. And the old one, at that point, should be maybe a month old or 2 months old. It's probably got a nice, healthy Brett pellicle on it, and I think it's been breaded enough. And then I'm ready to rack that into a keg.
That's pretty amazing. And it's an expensive device, right?
$1 is all you need. It's the $1 homebrew barrel, and I think people should experiment with different woods. I think people should experiment with different toasting levels. All of those people playing with bourbon barrels may decide that they want really a carbonized surface as opposed to a toasted surface, as opposed to a very vanilla surface. I think that having the ability to control the toasting is going to be absolutely vital for allowing us to really take advantage of wood for each individual beer style.
This has been very fascinating. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was a fun conversation, and one of these days I'll get around to playing with Brett and I may go looking for a table leg to stick into the mouth of my secondary carboy when I do. Another thing that I didn't get to talk to Raj about is he plays with this stuff called the ginger beer plant. And I intend to try to get in touch with Raj at a later date to talk more about that, because that was a really, really, really interesting conversation in the session that he gave down there at the conference. We were also lucky to get to spend some time with John Palmer while we were in Orlando. John continues to impress me with his knowledge of beer and the beer brewing process. His How to Brew book is in its 3rd edition. John gave a presentation called Engineer Your Beer, and he spent a few minutes with us to talk about what goes on inside the mash. Well, first of all, John, congratulations on the release of your book. Last time we talked to you, you were still in the writing phase.
Yeah. Thank you. It was a labor of love, and I'm so glad to have it done and available. And fortunately, the reviews have been pretty good. People really like it. So.
Yeah, people are. It's kind of the talk of the conference almost.
Yeah, that's really nice. It's really a hoot being here and having so many people come up and thank me for the book and having the information online. What can I say? I'm a brewer, and it's fun to talk about brewing, and it's fun to help other people with their brewing. So.
And your hat size doesn't seem to have grown much since you.
No, it doesn't.
I want to talk about your presentation yesterday. We're talking about the mash, essentially, and you got into fairly great detail about the mash. But you did an experiment, which we love experiments with Basic Brewing Radio. Talk about the experiment.
Okay, well, in the latest edition of the book, I looked at wort fermentability, and there's a diagram in there that I got from a friend of mine who written a paper, University of Australia at Tasmania. He did a lot of forced fermentations with different wort profiles, different mash schedules, to determine the effect of mashing temperature on wort fermentability and the sugar profiles. And he showed a very significant increase in fermentability as you move from 145 degrees on up to 152 degrees, and then a decrease in fermentability or apparent attenuation as you go from that 152 up to 156, 159, 160. And so I thought to myself, what a great experiment would be, or illustration really for the lecture, to brew 2 beers. One brewed at 150 degrees, mashed at 150 degrees, which is about the peak fermentability, apparent attenuation limit. And another one at a higher temperature where it's starting to really drop. And so we mashed the second beer, same recipe, same yeast, same hops, same malt grain bill, and we mashed that one at 158 degrees. And the end result was rather interesting. We did see a definite change in the apparent attenuation. The low temperature mash was at 150 degrees. I had an apparent attenuation of 80%, and that was going from 1050 down to 1010. The second beer, mashed at 158 degrees. Now these are single temperature infusion mashes, simply mashed in and held. That one had a higher degree of extract, an OG of 1052, but a higher finishing gravity of 1014, and the apparent attenuation of that beer was 73%. So when these beers were being passed around the room, people could taste and feel the difference in their mouth, the 2 degrees of fermentability of the two beers.
And there was a noticeable difference. I mean, it wasn't just smack you in the face, knock you over, different, right. But there was a noticeable difference between the two.
Yeah, it was nicely perceptible. Mm-hmm. The flavor profile differed a little too, and don't have a lot of data on why that would be. One reason could be that the higher attenuation lets the hops come a little stronger to the fore, so the residual sweetness is less, and so it seems like a more bitter beer. In general, people liked the lower mash temperature beer better. They felt that was a better balanced beer.
And you talked a bit about the ranges of temperatures in the mash and the enzymes that are activated. And were there surprises in your research on this edition of the book on those temperature ranges and the activity of those enzymes?
Yeah, it's interesting to, I guess, see from an academic point of view how quickly the beta amylase is degraded with temperature. I mean, its temperature optimum is between 140 and 150 F, but barley starch has not fully solubilized or gelatinized at those temperatures. It starts at 140 and finishes at 150 in terms of when it becomes soluble in the mash. You really need to get above 150 to get full extraction of the starch for the enzymes to convert it. So by the time you get it solubilized, a lot of your beta amylase has been denatured.
And the beta amylase, that's responsible for the digestible, the fermentable sugars, right?
Well, both alpha amylase, beta amylase, and limit dextrinase all work together. Three-man team to do the job. And there's even a fourth one, alpha glucanase, which is kind of, like the black sheep of the family. It just knocks off glucoses, and its contribution is kind of questionable. But the alpha will make maltose. It also makes larger dextrins, the maltotriose, the maltotetriose, which is a 4-sugar saccharide. But beta amylase only makes maltose, which comprises about 50+% of the wort, and that's our main fermentable sugar. So alpha will also make maltose, but it makes the other sugars also. Beta just makes the maltose. So it's our primary fermentable sugar enzyme.
And you were saying that the barley gelatinizes
between 140 and 150. So you have to get above 150 to get all the starch fully gelatinized or dissolved into the water and soluble and enzyme accessible. But in doing so, you've moved above the denaturing temperature for beta amylase. So it's a little race against time to get everything soluble and get that beta to work on it before it's denatured enough where the fermentability of the wort would fall off. Only the alpha and limit dextrinase would still be active. The limit dextrinase is active for 3 or 5 degrees higher than the beta. So you will generate more fermentability with time at, say, above 150, 155. If you keep that going, the alpha will continue to generate fermentable sugars, but it'll also generate a lot of more unfermentable sugars.
So what does that mean for strategies if you're a single temperature infusion masher?
If you're a single temp infusion masher, the closer you get to 150, the more fermentable your wort will be. Now, what in the experiment, what both Ed Meesum, who brewed the 2 beers for me, I gave him the recipe and stuff. What he noticed, and what I noticed later on in March when I did a classic American Pilsner type with a box of cornmeal off the shelf, was that at 150, conversion is pretty slow. Mashing in and watching that mash for an hour, it's still cloudy. I'm not getting the sweet smells that I'm used to getting with a higher temperature mash. Usually in the past, I'd mash at like 155, or even sometimes even higher. And so what we noticed is that, we definitely got the fermentability, but it took a long time. So a strategy for multi-rest mashing is to do a low temperature rest, say 145, 150 degrees. get a lot of that beta amylase working, generate a lot of maltose, and then step it up to like 158, 160 degrees even, and let the alpha amylase really finish converting all of that starch. And because now you've made sure that all your starch is soluble and gelatinized, and it's really accessible. The alpha can quickly knock it all off. You will have 10, 15 minutes of beta activity at those temperatures. I mean, in spite of, moving up through, you'll still have some beta amylase in solution that'll continue to work on that.
So are you saying that this kind of proves that a two-stage mash is preferable to a single stage? Or does it depend on the style?
It depends on the style. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. I think it's easier to say that a two-stage mash is better for better fermentability, for a drier beer. If you're shooting for a dry beer, then yes, you want a two-stage mash. If you're working with highly modified malts that convert very easily, then a single temperature infusion at 152 to 155, where you've cleared that solubilization temperature, you're going to get a very good compromise between beta activity and conversion time, and you're going to get, I think that's the typical mashing temperature for most of us, and you do get a good wort. You get a beer that has like a 75% attenuation.
Now, there was a question that came from the audience from a gentleman said that he does like a 5 or 6 step mash, starting at 122 and moving up.
Yeah.
And his question was, am I wasting my time?
Yeah, he and I talked about that more later. That was interesting. With the kind of style he's making, he's not making an adjunct beer where he's looking to provide more protein to the wort and more free amino nitrogen to the wort. So he really doesn't need the low temperature, the 120 degree rests for either beta glucan breakdown or protein solubilization. So those temperatures help him hydrate the mash to some extent, but they're really not accomplishing anything more. So I told him that he could skip those temperatures, move directly to his beta range, like 140 degrees, 145, mash in there, and start his mash there, and then climb through 150, 155, 160 if he wants to step it up like that.
So he's at those temperatures, he's not going to get the full gelatinization of the barley, but he'll start to get some conversion.
Right. Yeah. He'll see. The gelatinization is a progressive process. I mean, a proportion of the starch will gelatinize at 140. More will join in. I mean, and by the time you get to 150, it's hot enough that it all happens rather efficiently, I guess is the best way to put it, efficaciously. So alpha amylase can work on the starch, the ungelatinized starch, to some degree. You can attack it at the surface, but it's a surface effect. The finer you crush your malt, the warmer the temperatures, the more effective the enzymes and the hydration is at getting into the starch and making the starch chains accessible for conversion.
So if you're making an all malt beer, mm-hmm. and you're just wanting a standard style, a single temperature would still be just fine.
Yes. Pale ales. Most of my beers are single temperature. All of my pale ales, porters, stouts, they're all done that way. I even do my Vienna lagers that way. Now, knowing what I know now, I think the next Vienna I would do will probably be a 2-stage to get both the beta and alpha rests in there, because I would like a little drier Vienna than what I've been getting. My finishing gravities are often 10-12, up to 10-16 in one case, I remember. So if I want to drive it down to, say, 10-10, I'm gonna do the 2-stage rest.
Great. I appreciate you taking time.
Oh, very welcome. Yeah, thanks a lot. Good talking with you.
Well, thanks again to John Palmer and to Raj Apte for spending time with us. You can find out more about John's book at howtobrew.com. Well, next week, sadly, the last of our interviews from Orlando. Well, this one is a great one to end on, though. We'll talk to Matt Brendelson from Firestone Walker Brewing and John Mallett from Bell's Brewing Company about first wort hopping and dry hopping, and it may just change the way you brew. If you have questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Homebrewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country or sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And thanks to everybody who has ordered stuff from our shop and who's subscribed to BYO Magazine through the ad on our site. You basically enabled us to go to Orlando to get all this good stuff, so all the good interviews. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. Well, we'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.